I'd like to welcome everybody to Defense Committee today to talk about Canada and its relationship with NATO. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Robert Baines, President and Chief Executive Officer of NATO Association of Canada, in person. Thank you for coming. We have Alexander Moens, Chair, Political Science Department, Simon Fraser University via VTC, with some people in the background to welcome. And someone that hasn't been fed in yet via VTC, but we may see as we progress, is Robert Hubert. If he does, I'll bring him into the conversation as he shows up, but right now he's either lost in cyberspace on his VTC. So having said all that, welcome to everybody, and I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Baines for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to address the Standing Committee on National Defence, specifically on Canada's involvement in NATO. It is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. It is something I'm very concerned with. And the NATO Association of Canada is a charitable organization. It's nonpartisan, an NGO. It was founded in 1966 to explain the value of security and Canada's role as a member of NATO to Canadians. In order to achieve this goal, the NATO Association hosts about 20 events every year. We're national. A lot of our events are in Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, Calgary, all over the country. We put on a varying slew of events, student events, receptions, dinners, conferences, roundtables. But the real impact that we have is through social media. And this is something I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. We publish about 1,200 short journalistic articles. They reach through all the different social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. And what we try to do is to have a short, punchy article that'll get average Canadians interested in what's going on internationally. And of course, once they do that, then it's much easier for them to see the value of NATO and international security. On the content side, what we produce creates approximately 180,000 social media impressions every month. And finally, we also do have a high school program, which is extremely valuable, bringing in students, making sure that they have the availability of a model NATO kit and other information to support teachers to design lessons for Canadian classrooms. We're part of a NATO-wide NGO network called the Atlantic Treaty Association. Essentially, NATO, very early in its life, was decided that in order to ensure that the citizens of NATO countries understood the alliance, that each member should create an NGO that would be arm's length and grassroots through civil society to support NATO on the ground in each one of those countries. Because of the importance of sovereignty, this was very much a hands-off affair. It's a hugely valuable network, active in both NATO member and partner countries as well, and has very often been the first step in creating greater networks through NATO and non-NATO members. I must also say that the Secretary General of the Atlantic Treaty Association is a Canadian and a former intern from the NATO Association of Canada. Our most prominent sister organization, you will have heard of it, it's the Atlantic Council of the United States, based in Washington, D.C., and we're all in this together. Every single NATO nation has something like the NATO Association of Canada. I began leading the organization 7 months ago. I'm a baby in this, but I have been involved in the organization for 7 years. So I do have good information on the issues facing the alliance. And I've reviewed the presentations made by other witnesses, and note that we've got a lot of experts here. A lot of them have been involved with the NATO Association before. So I thought, rather than retreading some of the ground you've already heard on, especially Ukraine and some of the other issues regarding cyber, I wanted to discuss the communication of ideas generally. Canada, and I include the NATO Association of Canada in this, must do more to make sure that NATO, one of the greatest ideas in the history of international peace and security, is understood by the citizens of this country. I have a very simple message because I want you to hear it. The next generation of Canadians do not know what NATO is. They have no idea. We've seen this in many different situations. But why would they, then again? A flash of recollection from a single civics class, perhaps, grade 10, grade 12? A line in a movie they may have seen, a war movie, referring to NATO? Perhaps if they do pick up a newspaper, they might see NATO. Otherwise, they'll be taking a look at their own news feeds, which, unless they're already interested in it, they're not going to see it. So we've got a serious problem here, where the next generation are not going to know anything about NATO. Throughout your previous committee meetings, you've been presented with many reasons why NATO is important. It's one of the greatest and most successful ideas in the history, the long history, of international relations. NATO has helped to provide one of the longest periods of general global peace in the history of the world. It sounds trite, but it's just true, and nobody really gives it its due in this case. It was formed, of course, in a flurry of activity, resulting from the masterful resolutions of the Atlantic Charter with Churchill and Roosevelt, as a well from which NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, Marshall Plan, and so many other international organizations sprung from. These ideas were founded upon the refrain, never again. Never again will we, the Allied powers, let the world slip into global conflict and total war. Just not acceptable. The lattice work of organizations and institutions that was designed and has succeeded in creating an international rules-based order are now backed up by mutual agreements and the willingness to enforce them. That is quite new in the history of the world. Under this order, the globe's witnessed greater prosperity and development than in the history of our species. The condition has allowed for the lifting up of millions of people, billions, out of poverty, through the spread of medicine, and given opportunity to billions. Just look at the UN development goals. It's no small achievement. The connection between security, peace, and prosperity is clear. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this is not seen by the next generation. We've forgotten to tell the millennials how all of this came to be. The past 3 generations of Canadians had direct or second-hand experience of total war. They either lived through the horrors and hardships or heard from their parents or grandparents. Now, through the natural course of time, the rising generation born in Canada has no knowledge of war. Not through personal experience, nor through their parents or grandparents who lived it. This is a blessed state of affairs, obviously. I think everybody will agree. But it's one which also holds great danger. The danger lies in not appreciating the Herculean efforts undertaken to provide global peace and security, and then, obviously, taking it for granted. It's a vicious cycle. For many reasons, we failed to teach this narrative to the next generation. Members of my team, based in Toronto, recently went out to the University of Toronto to just do some sampling. What U of T students knew about NATO. Well, we've done this a few times, and within 1 or 2 points, it's always been 1 out of 25 people know what NATO is. Very often, North American Treaty, trade, is all that they get through. To actually identify what NATO is, it's unbelievable. This is U of T as well, not the general population. This in itself would be bad enough, but since, of course, 2014 and the annexation of Crimea by Russia, the destabilization of the value of our institutions has been unrelenting. We've been under attack constantly. There have been 2 major fronts here, of course. All of our allies in Eastern Europe have had a lot of social media barrages thrown at them, but also at the home front here as well. There's created an amazing amount of questioning about the value of our institutions and what they're for. Questioning's good. It's a good thing. First principles should always be addressed and should be gone back to again and again. But the answers to the questions are being supplied by those who do not believe in our international rules-based order. The answers to these questions are being given by Russia Today, bot factories in Russia. A recent report from NATO, the NATO Center of Excellence, stated that 70% of Russian language activity about NATO is automated. It was about 26% for English language. Automated, i.e. they are bots. This just came out in September. We're now finding out today that Russia backed $1 billion of Facebook funding, $191 million on Twitter. They're successfully creating wedges in the rules-based international community by spending billions of dollars on the counter-narrative to ours. Ideas, of course, are powerful. Narrative cannot be an afterthought. We have to be not afraid of telling our story, what has created NATO and our international institutions. It's not only an alliance of boots on the ground, it's an alliance of ideas and ideals. It's unique in that it has the commitment to back those ideals with action. You can reach 2% of GDP defense spending, you can purchase all the fabulous kit that D&D wants. You're still going to fail if you can't convince your own people of why you're doing what you're doing. Now, Minister Friedland's speech was an excellent articulation of our deals. I think everybody agrees on that. Admirable narrative, highlighting Canada's role in the creation of the current global framework of peace and security, something Canadians would want to be a part of, a story that Canadians want to be a part of. But nobody's going to spend 35 minutes watching the speech on YouTube. It's been watched 3,282 times since June. The Canadian Heritage Minute, posted a week later in June, has 164,000 views. This is the kind of initiative I'm suggesting. We need to make the message tighter, push it through social media. In short, we have to make sure the new generation see themselves as part of the story, because the only way they're going to see the story is if it is bite-sized in a moment as they're scrolling through their social media feed. NATO Public Diplomacy conducted research polls this spring, just before the NATO leaders meeting in May. Pew Research poll undertaken found that NATO support was certainly increasing in almost every country. Terrific. However, it also found that people under 30, women, and those without a university education were most ignorant of NATO. As a result, NATO Public Diplomacy is conducting a new campaign to get to the Canadian public as one of 5 countries it's rolling it out to experiment on. And it's enlisted the aid of the NATO Association of Canada, Global Affairs, and the Department of National Defence. The campaign's called We Are NATO, hashtag We Are NATO. Please write it down. Do take a look at it on social media if you haven't already. It's a platform which this government must seize. It's not, strictly speaking, NATO's job to convince citizens of its members that membership is good. We have to show our own value. We are, after all, sovereign nations. That's why I want to ensure that you're all aware of this campaign and that it begins to roll out and that Canada makes it its own. The NATO Association of Canada is well placed to make the most of the campaign because we can be most creative. Without the hindrances necessary in places of large departments and ministries, we can be a force multiplier, and we are. We intend to utilize memes, short videos, non-traditional ways of getting to millennials, because that's how to do it. And the status quo is not acceptable. Let me be clear. All of the alliance members have been bad at this. NATO makes this point quite well. Canada was chosen to take part in it because we're relatively good. But compared to Russia, we're missing in action. We're not even on the field of battle, and we must be. Our ideals deserve it, our history demands it, and the memories of those who came before us to create the greatest stretch of peace, prosperity, and security in the history of the world require it. It's a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that millennials need to know they're a part of. Thanks very much.